This isn't just another story about World War II. It's really a story about a bet, a gamble so huge, so incredibly audacious, that it literally changed the course of the 20th century. But it's more than that. This is a deep dive into a critical failure of the human mind, the ability to stare at undeniable facts, at cold, hard numbers that are spelling out your certain doom, and just choose not to believe them. We're going to explore one of the biggest, most consequential examples of this very human failure in all of history.
I really want you to think about that for a second. Because the story of Japan's high command in the Pacific War, well, it's one of the most extreme and tragic case studies ever of what happens when hope and pride and a belief in your own exceptionalism just completely steamroll a rational strategy. This is a journey into cognitive dissonance on a massive national scale, and trust me, the lessons are just as relevant today as they were 80 years ago.
All right, so to really get your head around the sheer nerve of this gamble, we have to rewind to the 1930s. Imperial Japan was on the move. They were driven by this desperate need for resources. We're talking oil, rubber, tin, and this grand vision of creating a self-sufficient empire, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. They'd already invaded Manchuria, they were bogged down in a huge, brutal war with China, but their biggest ambition, well, it put them on a direct collision course with the one country standing in their way, the United States. And the Japanese planners, they knew. They absolutely knew they were about to pick a fight with a giant.
And look, this wasn't some secret they only figured out after the war. These numbers, or numbers very, very close to these, were sitting on the desks of the generals and admirals in Tokyo. Japan, with just about 5% of the world's industrial power, was getting ready to take on a nation that commanded a mind-boggling 42%. I mean, even in the middle of the Great Depression, America's potential to make war materials was somewhere between 7 and 10 times bigger than Japan's. So how could any sane person look at this chart and say, yeah, let's go to war?
Well, because they didn't plan on winning a war of production. They knew they couldn't. Their entire strategy was built on psychology. The plan was, in a way, kind of brilliant in its desperation. Step 1, launch a surprise knockout blow against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. At the same time, snatch up all the resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia. The idea was that in just a few months, they'd build this massive defensive wall. And they believed the Americans, who they thought were soft, politically divided, and just wouldn't tolerate heavy losses, would lose the will to fight back. They figured America would ask for a peace deal, leaving Japan with its brand new empire. The entire war plan, all of it, hinged on one single, fatally flawed assumption, that they understood the American people.
And here's the craziest part. The man who planned the attack was also the one who understood the danger better than anyone, Admiral Yamamoto. He was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, but he'd also studied at Harvard. He'd been a naval attaché in Washington. He'd personally seen the car factories in Detroit, the endless oil fields in Texas. He once wrote, "Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America." He planned Pearl Harbor not because he thought they'd win in the long run, but because he believed a shocking quick punch was Japan's only chance, as slim as it was. He was basically hoping for a miracle, but his private words were a prophecy of total doom.
And for the first 6 months of the war, you know what? It looked like Yamamoto's crazy gamble might actually pay off. The illusion of an easy win was powerful, it was intoxicating, and in the end, it was completely blinding. I mean, the speed and the sheer scope of the Japanese advance were just breathtaking. In a matter of weeks, they had completely shattered Allied power in the Pacific. The Philippines, Guam, Hong Kong, even Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, they all fell, and fell fast. By the spring of '42, Japan controlled this huge empire. The resources they needed were finally flowing in, and their defensive perimeter looked solid. For the guys in charge in Tokyo, it was a total vindication of their strategy. That early success created this dangerous, intoxicating overconfidence, a belief that maybe America's industrial power had just been a paper tiger all along.
But even in the middle of all this celebration, there were warning signs if you were willing to look for them. The Doolittle raid in April of '42, when American bombers took off from a carrier and actually bombed Tokyo. I mean, it did almost no real damage, but the psychological shock was huge. The sacred homeland had been hit. It proved America had the reach and, more importantly, the guts for a long, hard fight. Then, just a month later at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese Navy's advance was stopped cold for the very first time. These were warning shots, little hints that the core assumption of the entire war, that America didn't have the will to fight, was dead wrong. But those warnings were completely ignored.
So this whole illusion of victory was about to be absolutely shattered at a tiny little island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean called Midway. It was here in June of 1942 that the entire momentum of the war was going to flip in one single devastating day.
Yamamoto's plan was to lure the last of the American carriers into a trap and destroy them, which would have sealed Japan's control over the Pacific. But, thanks to some brilliant American code-breaking, the trap was turned completely on its head. In the space of about 5 minutes on the morning of June 4th, American dive bombers found 3 Japanese carriers with their decks packed with fueled and armed planes. They were turned into floating infernos. A 4th carrier was sunk later that day. The losses? They were catastrophic. Irreplaceable. 4 of Japan's 6 large aircraft carriers, the very heart and soul of their naval power, were gone, and with them, hundreds of their best, most experienced pilots, an elite force that Japan's training programs could never, ever replace. Just like that, the strategic initiative was lost, for good.
But here's the thing. As devastating as Midway was, the real turning point wasn't the battle itself. It was what the battle unleashed. Yamamoto famously said he feared he had awakened a sleeping giant. Well, Midway was that giant's wake-up roar, and what came next was an industrial mobilization that the world had never seen before. Those numbers that were just abstract figures on a planner's desk were about to become a very real, very deadly tidal wave of steel. And this is where the numbers just get absolutely insane. After losing 4 carriers at Midway, a crippling blow, Japan managed to build just 6 more for the rest of the entire war. In that same time frame, the United States built 122. Let that sink in for a second. We're talking 17 massive Essex-class fleet carriers, each one better than the ships Japan lost, plus dozens and dozens of smaller light and escort carriers. At their peak, American shipyards were launching a brand new Essex-class carrier about every 6 weeks. This wasn't a gap, it was a chasm you could never hope to cross.
And it wasn't just ships, not by a long shot. The same story was happening in the skies. Over the whole war, Japan produced around 76,000 aircraft of all types. America, almost 300,000. In fact, in the single year of 1944, American factories built more planes than Japan did during the entire war. And not only were there more American planes, they were constantly getting better, while Japanese designs started to stagnate because they just didn't have the resources.
If you really want to grasp the scale of this industrial avalanche, just think about this one number, 63 minutes. At its peak, that is how long it took the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant to build one B-24 Liberator heavy bomber, a huge, complex, 4-engine machine rolling off an assembly line in about the time it takes to watch an episode of your favorite show. This wasn't war anymore. This was mass production applied to destruction on a scale the Japanese High Command couldn't even begin to comprehend, let alone try to match.
So, what happens? What do you do when you're a military leader and you are confronted with data like this? Data that says, in no uncertain terms, you cannot win. You really have 2 choices. You can accept reality and change your strategy, maybe look for a way out. Or you can reject reality and retreat into ideology. Japan chose the second path.
As the situation on the ground got worse and worse, the High Command in Tokyo clung even tighter to this concept of Yamato Damashi, the unique, unbeatable Japanese spirit. And this wasn't just about courage on the battlefield, it was a core national belief that the Japanese people themselves were just spiritually superior. It was a deep-seated conviction that their willpower, their warrior code, and their willingness to die could overcome any American advantage in mere numbers or machines. They truly believed that spirit could triumph over steel. It was a beautiful, powerful, and in the end, a completely suicidal idea.
But while the generals in Tokyo were talking about spirit, the men on the front line saw the grim reality of steel. This quote from Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest fighter aces who survived the war, is just heartbreaking. He and his fellow pilots weren't dumb. They could count. They saw the swarms of superior American planes, Hellcats and Corsairs, filling the sky. They watched their rookie comrades, with just a tiny fraction of their flight hours, get absolutely slaughtered. They knew the war was lost long before the High Command would ever admit it.
And this right here, this is the core of the whole thing. It's what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, that deep discomfort you feel when you hold 2 contradictory beliefs at the same time. Belief number 1, we are a superior, invincible nation destined to win. Belief number 2, the enemy is outproducing us 10-1 in everything that matters for war. When you're faced with that kind of conflict, the human brain often doesn't change the belief. It just throws out the uncomfortable fact. The numbers were just too horrible to accept, because to accept them meant that the entire war, all the sacrifice, had been for nothing. So the numbers were simply ignored.
You know, when a nation chooses to ignore reality, reality has a way of coming to collect. And in the case of Japan, from 1944 to 1945, reality didn't just come knocking. It kicked the door down with overwhelming, terrible force.
The end came in a series of just devastating hammer blows.
When Saipan fell in the summer of '44, that was the point of no return. It broke their defensive perimeter, and most importantly, it put American B-29 Super Fortress bombers in range of Japan's home islands. Then in October, at the Battle of Lake Gulf, the biggest naval battle in history, the Imperial Japanese Navy was basically wiped out as a fighting force in one last desperate gamble. From late '44 on, those B-29s began their relentless bombing runs, culminating in the horrific firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, which killed more people in one night than the initial blast of either atomic bomb. Finally, in August 1945, with the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the surprise Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the last shred of hope was gone. The emperor himself had to step in and force a military government that was still ready to fight to the last man to finally surrender.
This confession after the war from Admiral Toyoda, the final commander of the fleet, is maybe the most honest summary of the entire catastrophe. They knew the facts. The failure wasn't about intelligence, it was a failure of emotional and strategic understanding. They understood the numbers in their heads, but they couldn't bring themselves to believe what those numbers really meant in their hearts. They chose to believe in spirit over matter, and in doing that, they led their country to absolute ruin.
So what's the takeaway from all this? I mean, it's more than just a history lesson. It's a timeless blueprint for how strategic failure happens, whether that's in a war, in a business, or even in our own lives. First, you start with a deeply held but totally flawed assumption. In this case, that your enemy has no will to fight. Second, you actively ignore or explain away all the data that contradicts that assumption. Third, you let hope and pride and ideology take the place of cold, rational strategy. And finally, you suffer the inevitable and often catastrophic consequences.
And that brings us right back to the question we started with. It is so easy for us to look back now, with 2020 hindsight, and see their mistake. It seems so obvious. But their failure was a deeply, deeply human one. It's the refusal to accept a reality that just shatters our core beliefs. So the real challenge here is to turn that question back on ourselves, in our companies, in our governments, in our own thinking. What are the numbers that we're choosing to ignore? What's the uncomfortable data we're dismissing because it just doesn't fit the story we want to believe? That was their blind spot 80 years ago. The crucial question is, what's ours today?